Well, that is time to start. Damon, would you like to get started? Thanks for everyone joining us. And I'm going to hand things over to Dr. Damon Abdi to go over the green infrastructure concepts for the landscape. Thanks for joining us.
All right. Well, thank you, Angelique, and thank you, everybody, for attending. My name is Damon Abdi, and I am an assistant professor of landscape horticulture at the LSU Ag Center Hammond Research Station. Today, I'm going to talk about some green infrastructure concepts for the landscape, give you some background on that, talk about some of the research that we're doing here, and some of the ways that you can implement this within your businesses. So a little bit about me. I am an assistant professor of landscape horticulture over at the Hammond Research Station. And at the Hammond Station, we specialize for the state of Louisiana in ornamental plants. And we serve the industry through doing extension work, working directly with some of the landscape contractors, nurseries, architects, and also the general public when it comes to horticulture. We also do quite a bit of research here. And my research program focuses in green infrastructure features as well as landscape management. And I really try to focus on practical solutions for our stakeholders. And that really stems from my background in the landscape industry. So I've spent my youth working in the industry, working in both residential and commercial landscaping in the install and the maintenance sector. And I was intent on starting my own company. So I went to Penn State to pursue my bachelor's in landscape contracting, but I really enjoyed a lot of the scientific aspects of this class. And I kind of shifted into wanting to get into that arena more so than getting into the industry. And I started pursuing a PhD in horticulture. And I did that at Michigan State, looking at ways to improve the sustainability of nursery production. If you'd like to connect with me, there's some QR codes. So that way you'll be able to get in contact with me and you can stay abreast of what's going on. But what's going on today is we're going to discuss green infrastructure features and really start off by giving a definition and comparing it to the current status quo. We're going to follow that up with talking about several different examples of green infrastructure and then some of the research that we're doing to really help push that forward. Then we're going to tie it all together by talking about the application of some of this work and how it means businesses can be more sustainable, how our landscapes can be more sustainable, and then to advocate for more support for green initiatives. So starting off with gray infrastructure versus green infrastructure. Gray infrastructure really is just that system of gutters, pipes, and tunnels to convey water. So when I think of gray infrastructure, I think of concrete and I think of metal. So pipes and drainage areas. Green infrastructure, of course, would be using more natural solutions, right? Using things like plant and soil systems, perhaps even non-living features like permeable surfaces to really attenuate some of the issues that gray infrastructure deals with, particularly water management. So green infrastructure is really using natural solutions to address water management. So these are strategically planned. We're really using that natural features, but we're putting some of that human control over it to really make it as functional in the landscape as possible. But to really simplify it all, we're using natural solutions to anthropogenic problems. So when we think about the impact that humans have had on the landscape, we got to look at how it's divided throughout our country. So approximately 80% of the US population is going to live in urban areas. So nearly 260 million out of 330 million. And this number is increasing. So we've seen an increase during the 2010s of about 6.4% in the actual population in urban areas. But just as importantly is these urban areas are becoming more congested, where we're seeing a 9% increase in the density of population over that same time. And if you look at this map, you can probably cherry pick out some major metropolitan areas. Chances are some of the contractors on this can pick out their home area in this. So we see that, throughout the country, we're seeing these very densely populated areas. And the challenge with that is we have to build around it and really plan out how this is going to affect the environment and, of course, our human population. So starting off at looking at the composition of urban areas, the paved surfaces is going to be roughly 29 to 39% of that area. Rooftops, another 19 to 25%, and then vegetation is just a small fraction about that. Anywhere from a fifth to a third of that area is actually going to be vegetated. And the effect on the environment for that is that that impermeable surface, that water, that rainfall that hits it, is it's going to run off somewhere. So having all of these impermeable surfaces is going to exacerbate issues with runoff, drainage, and flooding concerns. This can also create hotter cities, increase that heat island effect. But you also get a lot of pollutants in these urban areas, both things that you can see, like the litter in this image, but also some of the contaminants that you can't necessarily see. And it's really important that we optimize these spaces in the built environment, because the lack of green spaces has dire effects on communities, and it's been shown to have effects on people's mental health, their physical activity, and these effects are felt not equally throughout cities, and oftentimes in underserved areas, you see green infrastructure that's lacking, if it's even there. So we really need to think about green spaces as an engineering tool to improve the environmental and the social spaces of our communities. And that's what really makes green infrastructure so unique, is that it's truly this intersection of the engineering, art, and education. So engineering, how we are building this and what kind of effects it's going to have on the environment. Certainly, that's quite apparent when it comes to water management, dealing with some of that runoff. But we also got to think about the artistic side of this, implementing green infrastructure in a way that's not just purely utilitarian, just trying to take in all that water. We want it to be aesthetically appealing so that people enjoy it and so that people also pay for it. And then education, of course. We need to really make sure that we're extolling the benefits of green infrastructure to really help advance its implementation. Really show the immense value that having these installations have on our communities is going to do a lot to support the industry as well. So here in South Louisiana, in most years, we're thinking about water. This year we were thinking about water, but we were thinking about it in droughts too. But in any sense, we really want to make sure that we have some water-wise landscaping. And rain gardens are a great feature, a great green infrastructure feature for attenuating some of that massive amounts of water that happens in urban areas with all that impermeable surfaces. And there's many ways that you can get creative with it. I work with several contractors quite a bit, including Green Man Dan in New Orleans. And he does a lot of very creative water focused installations. As you can see, we've got a rooftop gutter feeding directly into some raised beds. And then we've also got a very large rain garden area that is created in this. So it's really important to think about too much water, but we should also be prepared for the other end of that pendulum. So if we think back a few months ago, especially those of us in the Deep South along the Mississippi watershed, we've been exposed to quite a prolonged drought throughout this year. And that drought in the Mississippi watershed, there were some concerns about water availability, that there was going to be sufficient water. There was concerns over a saltwater wedge moving up the Mississippi River. And well, these concerns didn't necessarily manifest in some of the worst case scenarios we were thinking, it still emphasized the importance for us to have some kind of resilient systems for when we do not have that water availability. And rainwater harvesting is a great feature in green infrastructure that can be used to attenuate that. Now, rainwater harvesting is something that can really help offset some of these water concerns, but it's going to depend on how you go about it throughout every state. So the Department of Energy has this really handy map that's interactive, and it shows based on your state what information you should look at to move forward with it. So the regulations for rainwater harvesting is going to vary by state, both in terms of installation codes and then what you're using the water for. Generally, in pretty much every case, it's going to be non-potable. It should be self-explanatory there, but sometimes we got to be explicit. And in fact, rainwater harvesting in a lot of cases can be encouraged or incentivized both by tax credits, but also by state-specific resources that are really going to push for some of that. So this is something that should be kept in mind. And rainwater harvesting can be done, both in very simple ways, like the image on the left here that has a rainwater collection barrel that's just collecting a small area off presumably a shed, or you could have a larger barrel in more commercial installations. Something to keep in mind in both of these is you see that that tank is elevated just enough. So that way you'd be able to have some of that hydraulic pressure, some of that gravity fed effect. So that way you can do some micro irrigation with that if you so choose. Which leads me to my next point. When we're thinking about really managing green infrastructure, yes, we're thinking about how to collect water, both if we've got too much, but also if we don't have enough. But we really got to think about being judicious and being cognizant of how we're applying our water. And with that, there's many different ways to apply irrigation, right? And it's going to depend on a variety of things. For example, when you're installing new plant material, you're going to water differently than a more mature landscape. And you got to consider that and think about which methods you're going to use. Are you going to use drip irrigation? Are you going to use more of a wide spreading micro sprayer that covers a larger area? You also got to think about the timing of irrigation. When are you going to apply irrigation? And are you going to apply that in a single application or split? And just to elaborate on some of these points, for a mature tree, and you're going to want to put water so that way it reaches way deep into that soil area, allowing a low and slow kind of method, using a soaker hose, for example, slowly applying water so it meanders its way through the soil profile may be your best bet. Whereas if you have a bed with a lot of annuals or plants with more of their roots towards the surface, having some of those micro sprayers that cover a larger area and keep it evenly hydrated may be preferred to you. When it comes to timing of irrigation, generally applying it early in the morning is a good practice, before the winds start picking up, before the sun comes up and you start getting a lot of that evapotranspiration going on. Applying early in the morning is good. And then think about how many times you're applying, etc. It's going to depend on your weather. One of those images that I showed there was irrigation bags. This is one method that some people use for installing when they're installing new plants. You fill it up and it lets water go out slowly, but there is no silver bullet. There's no set and forget. With a lot of these bags, you got to make sure that you're removing them. You don't want to just have that root collar completely covered up at all times. You can have disease issues if you do that. So you want to make sure that using these tools, you can help water, but you don't want to leave it on going too much. And some other things keep in mind. If you see a black bag, in very, very hot environments, it might get super warm. For plants that are reemerging, they got cut back or damaged and they're growing up from the base, you're probably not going to want to cover up some of those leaves that you're going to ask for disease issues. So just be cognizant about it. And one of my favorite things in my position is just going around and observing different things in the landscapes. And I've got pictures dotted throughout here that I'm going to touch upon. But some of the things I'll notice is in the image on the left, you've got sprayers that are irrigating and that water's not going where you want it to. So first off, I see these irrigation heads irrigating in the middle of the day. Of course, we want to irrigate in the morning, but chances are it's probably windy. You're seeing that the irrigation in those sprayers is getting blown onto that sidewalk. I see issues with that. I see issues with this central image here. You've got a drip irrigation system, but a lot of that line is overhanging outside of that. I see a tripping hazard, and I see some other issues with that. Image on the right, we see a drip line over a row of plants. Now, what's going to happen if that black pipe has water sitting in it all day and it's a super hot day? It's going to get super hot and it could lead to some damage for plants. So everything with your irrigation, you want to take a nuanced look and try to see if there's something that can be improved upon. And it's really important to know what the plants are in your landscape when you're really trying to support these green infrastructure features. When we think about green infrastructure in urban areas, we think about our historic trees, right? So it's very important for us to understand which trees and plants we have in the landscape. A historic live oak, such as the one that you're going to see in that top picture there, has been around for many decades, pushing over a century in a lot of ways. You're going to manage that plant much differently than you'd manage a bed of coleus that you'd see in the bottom image, because you can't simply replace a 100-and-something-year-old tree at all. So you got to think about which plants you have in the landscape, and then you want to think about the timeline that they've been in the landscape. Are they established there for a long time, or have they been recently planted? And then especially when you're on a design stage and you're thinking about creating your palette of plants to use, it's great to really group by similar water demand, right? That's something that it's been hammered home for quite a while, is group by similar water demand. But sometimes I try to suggest in my own compositions is I use indicator plants. I use a plant that I know is going to be sensitive to droughts faster than all the other plants. And when I see drought symptoms in that gives me the idea to irrigate the rest of the plants before issues come up with that. And that image there with the coleus, you might see that one area where there's sufficient wilting going on there. To me, that's a diagnostic tool. I see that, I would be inclined to think that there might be a busted irrigation valve somewhere near there, and I'd want to fix that. So there's a whole lot of some of these little observations that I have the privilege to write about. So in Synced, I contribute to every issue talking about different little topics. And one recently, I believe this was sometime last year, was technologies for irrigating the urban landscape. So if you want to get more information on these kind of topics, I'd definitely go check out some of these issues. So that's a great resource to learn more about that. Now, when we're thinking about supporting these kind of landscapes, we really want to create a diverse, resilient landscape. Not only does that create more appeal by having a bunch of different plants with different forms, flowers, foliage, textures, etc., but it also allows a little bit more resilience to the biotic and abiotic stressors. Way before our time, over 100 years ago, the American landscape was lined with these massive elm trees with that nice vase-like architecture that creates these natural hallways down our streets. Now, unfortunately, Dutch elm disease really came and decimated these rows of elms. And unfortunately, you can't just replace massive trees like that overnight, but you can prevent a mass issue like this from happening by having more diversity in your plants. But it's not just about having more diversity in your plants. You want to have sustainable management, particularly when we're thinking about urban areas where it's going to be very, very hot, where you're going to have a lot of foot traffic, where flooding and water management is going to be even more important. So we want to make sure that we can have a low input maintenance plan for some of our landscapes. But we don't want it to be as low input as we see in this image here, where we've got this lonesome crepe myrtle in the middle of this pit, and it looks like it's quite literally hung out to dry. So we want to ensure that plants are protected. So how do we balance these two concepts? Cutting down our maintenance, the time, effort, and resources for that, but also making sure that our plants are protected and not in harm's way. Fortunately, I also talk about that. And I believe in one of the most recent issues of Synced, I talked about increasing diversity of plant material, particularly with regards to new options. So boxwoods, boxwood disease issues have been something that's been really, really prominent, especially down here in the South. We've got, boxwood blights or dieback, things like that. And having other plant alternatives there can help insulate you against some of these disease issues. So in this article, Beating Around the Bush, aptly named, I talked about 2 boxwood alternatives that could also be used in the landscape. So check that out in Synced. And if that's not enough for you, we also got articles in there that talk about some of the maintenance practices, how we can take care of our plants without harming some of the pollinators. So talking about pesticide management and some other kind of ways to really just be more sustainable in the landscape. So there's a whole lot of topics on that, but if you want more information, that's a great place to start. So we're talking about really urban vegetation, right? We covered water, we covered a little bit on plants, but why are plants so important in that urban area? Well, by having a healthy urban canopy, we can reduce the heat island effect. Like I said, it's been a prolonged drought, extremely hot in New Orleans this year. But when I'm walking in the city, I'd much rather take this path where I know I'm a little bit more protected from that sun. So really maintaining this urban canopy is very important, but there's challenges with it. The soils in urban areas are generally really compacted. And this is from past construction, but also a lot of foot traffic, people walking over these areas. And as those feet stomp, as those tires drive over those areas, it just presses down that soil and it restricts the air and water flow to the roots. And you see this issue particularly in urban areas. And this is an image from Esplanade Avenue in downtown New Orleans. And something that they did is they put defined walking paths between these historic live oaks that are there. So adding in defined walking paths is a design feature that's not even using plants, but is helping to protect some of these plants. Because of course you get too much compaction and then those roots are going to be searching for air and water regardless. They're going to go getting closer to the soil surface trying to find it. And that's where you get these girdling roots. That's where these roots lift up. And this can lead to a lot of issues, obviously. When sidewalks are being lifted up, it's a huge tripping hazard. So you got to be careful of that. So I know I covered a lot of information, but I barely scratched the surface. And this is really to highlight some of the challenges and the opportunities for green infrastructure work. So some of the things that I'm interested in are optimizing water-wise landscaping, both in terms of water retention, rain gardens, but also managing irrigation. I'm looking for improving best management practices. What can we do to give plants a better chance at establishment in the landscape? And then what can we do to really help create a better long-term maintenance plan for them? And something else we also want to do is really identify new and underutilized plant material. This expands our palette of plants that we can use and improve biodiversity, but also gives some of that resiliency to some of the environmental stressors that we talked about before. So of course, I work at the Hammond Research Station with the LSU Ag Center. And well, most of my job's extension, working with the industry a lot. I do a lot of research to help solve some of these problems that I brought up earlier. So rain gardens, some of the work that my lab does is evaluate different rain garden medias. Tree establishment, can we improve planting practices? Ground cover applications, using ground covers, can we spread over some of those bare areas of soil? As we think back to that image of that bare soil around that crepe myrtle, how can we cover up some of those areas? And then other ways that we can really help moderate some of those soil conditions, particularly temperature when we think of urban environments. So to move quickly through some of these things overall, we've just recently gotten into rain garden research and we're trying to optimize these systems. And the way that we're seeking to do that is by working on different blends of media that can be used as the substrate within these rain gardens. And some of the features we're looking for are going to be how much water these substrates can hold. How long can these substrates last in a rain garden before breaking down? And then what kind of physical and chemical considerations do we have to put in? How do these change the pH? Other things like that. And of course, we want to look for the viability in rain gardens. So we want to see how these plants are going to do for that. So we do a lot of lab-based work to get some of these properties there. And then we're hoping to expand this into different rain garden installations, such as this one you'll see here, which was in a location in Tennessee. Looks like they had some kind of hibiscus growing in these rain gardens. If you look at the bottom right image, you see a standpipe there for when that water level gets too high. So these are features that are currently in use, certainly aesthetically pleasing, but have a very defined engineering purpose. And our goal here is to really help squeeze as much out of them as we can. So that's the rain garden research, but we also talked about plant establishment research. And one of the biggest issues that landscape contractors come to me with is installing root-bound plants in the landscape. And what we did is we selected crepe myrtle natchez because this is a very common landscape species in the South. And this past year, after the intense freeze we got late 2022, early 23, we saw quite a bit of damage to weather sensitivity. So we wanted to investigate this plant. Now, we talked about root-bound plants, installing those in the landscape. All of us, when we pull a plant out of a container, we're very likely to see those roots circling around, right? Those roots are just going in a circle there and maybe are not going to be as adventitious and break out when they get into the landscape. Now, that's why a lot of landscape contractors have different pre-root manipulation treatments. Very commonly, you're going to see somebody just use a box cutter, make some slices. You'll also see some people chop the base of that root ball. And you also see some people really take it to the next level by fully teasing and butterflying those roots out so that they're broken open. So that's precisely what we did at the station. And we planted 20 different crepe myrtles using those exact methods that we talked about. And this was planted in spring of 2023. And what we're doing is we're measuring growth index. So getting an overall idea of the volume of the plant. We're also looking at stem caliber. And then, of course, we're looking just for visual cues. We're in ornamental horticulture, so looks is very important for us. So what are we seeing when it comes to flowering? What are we seeing when it comes to vigor and just overall health of the plant? And to date, all these plants, they've taken off. We haven't had any loss so far, despite this drought. And they were all fertilized the same, watered the same pest management. So the only differences between these plants was just simply how we manipulated those roots. As far as conclusions from it, well, we're gonna have to wait and see. Those are just planted in April of 2023. So what we want to do is we want to observe it over a couple years. That way we can see if there is any resiliency to some of these weather challenges. We want to be able to observe growth over a longer period of time. And then finally, we want to dig those roots up after 2 years and actually get down in there and see, do these roots morphology change in response to some of these pre-plant treatments? So we're really looking forward in finding that out in the future. And the importance of this is that getting plants in urban areas is one of the best ways to cool it down, but you want to make sure that you're doing things right the first time. And whether there is a difference between root manipulation or not, that's really what we're trying to find out with regards to just at least crepe myrtles in this one condition. But we're really doing our best so that we get trees a healthy chance to survive, especially when you think about compacted areas where those soils are going to be really, really compacted, poor airflow, and you really want to give it the best chance at success. Here you got a willow oak that's in a parking lot, and you can see that those are the prime parking spots, that canopy is offering that shade. Now, I don't know how many people want to get back into a hot car at the end of the day, but I am certainly not one of them. Neither are these people. So we really want to do what we can. And this is also where some of that education about the importance of green infrastructure in urban areas is very important. There were some contractors in Tennessee that I was working with, and they were staging some of their supplies and equipment. And of course, they did it the right way by not piling this up around the base of the trees. But for any of us who've been contractors who have to navigate with multiple different subcontractors on a job, sometimes things aren't always understood. There's lines in communication. But the thing from this is you do not want to store anything right around those trees. You want to protect it, but also you can kind of sell them on it by saying, look, you're protecting these trees, which is the right thing to do, but these trees are also going to cast some of that shade over these materials, keep it from degrading as fast, and just make it a little easier to work with. So we also talked a lot about bare areas in the landscape and some of the issues with that, right? So we want to think about use of space. We want to cover soils, and what could be better than a ground cover? So some of the other research that we've been doing at the station is looking at different ground covers for a variety of reasons. Now, ground covers can be a low maintenance alternative to turf grass areas when selectively used. And ground covers offer a wider array of features than turf typically does. Just in this image alone, you'll see flowers, different foliage types. You get variegated foliage. You get different morphologies, different looks to this ground covers that really can make it a little bit more intriguing in the landscape. But ground covers also can provide several kinds of ecosystem services and supporting biodiversity, but also good for managing water. So some of the research that we've done at Hammond is investigating a bunch of different kind of ground covers, ranging from annuals, tender perennials to perennials. And what we wanted to see was, in terms of planting density, can we use less plants but still cover an area very, very rapidly? Basically, can we cover the same area of plants with half the plants? So we looked at the typical recommended density of planting, which is getting that immediate effect, putting more plants in at once. And we compared that with a suboptimal planting density, where we used less plants with the hopes that over time, those plants would grow and cover up the entire soil. So some of the things we did with this was we quantified how much of the soil was covered by the ground covers. And then we also got some insights to how those ground covers looked. So in this image, those top rows, that's going to be the recommended planting density, where if you wanted that almost immediate effect, that's how many plants you would plant in 1 square meter, for example. The suboptimal planting density is a more spaced out version of that. You're using less plants, it's less dense, and you're hoping that those plants are going to grow in and provide adequate coverage. Now, as you see this over time, at about 6 weeks and certainly by 12 weeks, there is no difference in the amount of coverage between planting these at the typical density versus the suboptimal density. And this is a volvulus glomeratus blue days. So this is an annual ground cover in our area, and it offers some of those nice blue flowers. We saw this with some other plants that are annuals in our area, particularly sweet potato. So same theme in the pictures here. You see the optimal density in week 0 on the top left, and you see the suboptimal density. And those certainly look much, much different, right? You got a lot more coverage when you're putting that upfront investment. But after 6 weeks, there really is no difference. The key takeaway from this is that sweet potato plants grow absolutely quickly. And those are going to get equivalent coverage very, very rapidly. But you do notice that there's some dieback over time. Week 18, week 24, they're looking a little less than stellar. This was because in our area, we had these, and we grew these in a rural area, and a bunch of deer were coming through, and those deer were feasting on it. So deer certainly like these sweet potatoes. This would be something that you'd probably want to weigh if you're doing a rural or maybe suburban landscape. But in an urban area, you probably aren't too concerned about deer getting in there. 2 other really common ground covers, you got mondo grass and you got liriope. So these are very, very common ground cover, perennial ground covers in the southern landscape. And basically for both of these is that if you wanted that rapid coverage, you're going to have to put that upfront investment. For the plants that we chose, they weren't spreading quick enough to necessarily justify spacing them out more, unless you want to take a more measured approach. So basically, the overall results of that is that for the annual species we looked at, you can plant those at a reduced density, and you're going to get the same amount of coverage. For many of the tender perennials we looked at, including things like ficus pumila, there was no differences between densities. But for plants such as liriope, mondo grass, or Asian jasmine, if you wanted more soil coverage, you were going to have to put that initial upfront investment. There's been some more work on ground covers that we've done in our lab, and that's a link to a free, or it's a full research article on ground cover research, but it's not behind a paywall. A lot of research is, but if you want to check that out, there's a QR code to that. But in this project, we looked at different irrigation methods and how it affected ground cover spread. So we compared overhead irrigation versus micro irrigation. And we looked at two species. We looked at liriope, of course, which is very common. And then we looked at Wedelia. Wedelia is a very, very rapidly spreading plant, which you might not want in your landscape. We only selected that because it's a rapidly spreading plant, and we wanted to use that as a model for this. And basically, if you look above the red line, you've got liriope and Wedelia, both under overhead irrigation. You see that Wedelia is spreading and covering that area very quickly. See the liriope is growing a good bit. And you see the same themes when those two plants are micro irrigated. To really distill it down, Wedelia is going to spread, give that coverage, and it's very, very fast growing. Again, you might not want it in the landscape for that reason. In some areas, it's not recommended. But it actually doesn't matter how you irrigated it. The irrigating method did not have any effect on the way it spread. And we also saw that Wedelia was taking up more water. So we were seeing that certain ground covers will evapotranspire more than others. The last area of research that I'm going to touch on is mulch. So mulch is, of course, a feature that pretty much every landscape contractor I can think of or have worked with does. And the reasons we put down mulch vary, but it's typically to insulate soils where we want to keep that temperature and those moisture levels pretty consistent. But mulch also looks good. A good mulching job is going to look professional and just look nice in the landscape. But also mulch suppresses weeds. But there is quite a bit of dialogue about what the proper depth for pine straw is. And that was a question that we wanted to scientifically investigate. So we compared 1 meter plots that had either no mulch with 5, 10, or 15 centimeters of pine straw, which would be 2, 4, and 6 inches. And then we buried a soil temperature and moisture sensor underneath each of these plots of pine straw at different depths, and we measured it throughout spring of earlier this year. Now, basically, what we saw was that as the air temperature this spring, that's this gray line that is going all haywire over the place, that's the ambient air temperature. And this past spring is quite fluctuating, going up and down all the time. And what we see is that the temperature under the different depths of mulch actually changes, and that having different depths of mulch is going to offer more buffering to some of these temperature effects. Now, I'm not going to sit on that slide and spend all day on it, but if you're interested in learning more about how mulch depth can moderate soil conditions, there's another research article up there. Again, that is completely open access, and even better, it's a quick read. It's a 2.5-page article that will really have more of the details on that. But if you're looking for the take-home message, is that without having any mulch, those soil temperatures fluctuate rapidly. And that even just 5 centimeters or 2 inches of pine straw is going to have an effect. But eventually, there's a point where you're getting diminishing returns. And we saw that 4 inches versus 6 inches of pine straw really had the same effects on the soil temperature, which certainly has different considerations for your operation. We'll touch on that later, though. Some of the other things we do at the Hammond Station is evaluate and implement new plant materials. So we already talked about the importance of having diversity in plant material. And what we do is we evaluate the performance of a whole bunch of different plants here at our station and our trial gardens. We also get information on consumer perception. So we're assessing both the plant vigor and vitality, but how people feel about them, how interested they are to including those in their garden. So we do a bunch of plant trials here at the Hammond Station. We're looking at annuals, perennials, and woody species. And if you go online, we've got a bunch of information throughout the years that we've compiled. And this is some really, really great detailed insights for a bunch of plants, especially for those you in the deep South and the Gulf region that want to see how plants are going to perform in our area, highly recommend checking out that website. So we take our measurements, we take all of our data, but it's also important that we get data from our stakeholders, from our master gardeners, from our public. So at events throughout the year, we have folks come and they come and vote on these plants. And we use that information both in research, but also as a way to help the industry know which plants people are really buzzing about. And then it's really important to take all this research, from the rain garden work, from the plant establishment work, to the ground covers, to the mulch, to the trials, and put it into a way that people can actually use. Information's great, but it needs to have some kind of outlet and some kind of way it can be applied. And it's really important to identify opportunities for implementation, find ways that we can beat the ground level, we can grow up in certain ways, like we're seeing this living wall right there. And it all starts really with dissemination to stakeholders and the public. And here in Louisiana, I work very, very closely with the Louisiana Nursery Landscape Association. They do a lot to support my program, and they do a lot to support the industry as a whole. So for stakeholders in every state, especially those in Louisiana, get involved with them. They will really help to support our industry. And the education days is something that my extension program have been really advancing, where in Louisiana, in different parts of the state, we go to different areas and we bring a rotating team of panelists to talk about different topics in the landscape. It's a great way to give back to the industry, great way to get information out there. So landscape education days, really happy with that. When we're talking about practical applications, I'm going to tie all of this work that we put in here and show how you can use that in your businesses, right? So we talked about protecting that urban canopy, right? We've got historic trees, live oaks all throughout Louisiana. We talk about putting in new trees, how we don't want to have people walking all around it, compacting the soil and damaging it. This image here really helps to make this point. So what you got here is you got a ground cover of Asian jasmine growing all throughout these plants, right? So that ground cover physically serves as a barrier. People aren't going to go walking on that ground cover, at least they shouldn't. It's keeping people from walking around that newly planted magnolia that you see in the left of the image. It's keeping people from walking around the roots of that live oak. It's also keeping people from walking around that electrical box there. So you're using ground covers to look good, but you're also using it strategically to change the landscape, right? But it also looks very aesthetic. It looks nice. You got that nice lime green color at this time, and you don't have to mow it. So your maintenance is a lot lower. You don't have to get your mowing equipment inside this very congested urban area. Talked about mulch earlier too. We see mulching to affect soil conditions around that newly planted magnolia there. They've got a nice mulch bed around it, protecting it, helping insulate some of those soils. But that's not enough an example of mulch. I really wanted to hammer this image home in other ways. So on the left image, we got a very, very thick mulch application depth. And that's in a golf course in New Orleans. So you've got a massive area. And of course, on a golf course, distance aesthetics at all times is prioritized. They're not interested in cutting their mulch costs by 10%. They want to make sure it looks good at all costs. Plus, you've got larger trees. So from a distance, you can put it on very, very thick. And as long as you're not choking out those root crowns, you're probably going to be fine. You can do this job once, and then you're really trying to prevent weeds at all costs. Now, an image on the right is a small planting box in New Orleans, and this might take a different approach, right? You've got above ground, and it's small plants, some small Indian hawthorns. So you might see some weather sensitivity, but also this is a very, very public area. People can walk right up close. Too much mulch is going to detract from the aesthetics. It's going to choke out some of those Indian hawthorns, and people are going to be up close to it. Also think about from your position of job security. Having multiple applications of mulch might be a benefit. And also, if you're in an urban area like that, and there's not a whole lot of open fields around, you might have less chances of weeds establishing. Weeds will establish anywhere. They always find a way somehow, but these are just things that you can question. Talk about practical application of ground covers, right? So in the image of the left, we've got a parking lot strip there that is just turf, and poorly looking turf at that. Image on the right, you've got Liriope muscari as a ground cover, which looks like a very, very coarse grass. Looks like it, even though it's not. It gives that same kind of aesthetic, but there's several key differences between it. So on the left, you see minimal biodiversity support. You're just mowing that over. Liriope, you're going to get those little purple flowers, and you get the vegetative cover, and it's going to be at a higher height, better for biodiversity. Talk about foot traffic. People are going to walk on whatever they're going to walk on, but if I'm betting, I think people are going to walk on grass more likely. So you're combating that. Think about maintenance. Image on the left, you're dealing with water, fertilizer, and pesticides. Yeah, you're going to deal with that a little bit with Liriope, but probably not going to be as demanding as turf. Think about the weekly maintenance mowing, right? Weekly or bi-weekly, chances are you're taking a 2-stroke weed whacker and knocking that thing out. You're not going to be riding a riding mower on it when it's that narrow, but the amount of time that it's going to take to maintain that might not be what you want. And that also goes hand in hand with the emissions per mowing event, especially if you're using 2 strokes. So something to consider. So to kind of tie it all together, advocating for green infrastructure is really how we can help advance the industry. And this takes place in the classroom and in the community. And it also takes place online. So checking out some multimedia resources, such as this webinar that we're on right now. Synced and Angelique, they do a great job with putting things into new arenas. So check that out. Check out our Hammond Station Field Day online as well. And then really try to make horticulture great for everybody, making it more accessible. I led an initiative to make signs with Braille and large text images to help some of our friends who need assistance in certain areas, but also hort technology, short papers like that mulch article I talked about earlier. That's open access. It's 2.5 pages, and it's something that if y'all read it and have questions, feel free to reach out to me. I want to make it usable, make this a usable resource for people. So my closing thoughts on this is that green infrastructure is engineering and art, and that there's opportunities to improve resource efficiency, how we use our space, and protecting our plants. And dissemination and application are very, very important, where we can really connect with diverse groups, public and professionals, put it into action. But I also like to make horticulture fun. So I write for the Greater New Orleans Gardening newsletter every month. And my column is kind of unique in that I do a lot of 80s and 90s music puns. I'm sure you can probably get some of these. Not every rose has its thorn. Talking spray heads, November
Love
rain
that.
collection. Yeah. So some fun articles there. Here, if you want to reach out to me more, here's my information. There's my LinkedIn page. I've got a lab Instagram that's got some fun stuff there. That's a good way to reach out. And you can get any of this information from myself or Angelique. I want to thank the staff and faculty at the Hammond Research Station where I'm at. They put tons of tireless hours into making everything look great, and I'm very proud to show off a lot of their work. Thank you to the LNLA for always supporting me. I got a bunch of references here. If you don't believe me, you can always go fact check me, but we don't want that. And then I want to advertise for Synced Live in Atlanta. So I had the privilege last year to be at Synced Live in Atlanta, and it's a really unique event. You've got pretty much all different sectors of the green industry there. You've got academics such as myself, you've got contractors, architects, you've got people, doing some of the stuff that you'd never even imagine. You see robotics there. You're seeing the intersection of so many different areas. So I would highly recommend checking that out, and you will find me there. I will be there and looking forward to continuing some of this dialogue. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for attending, but of course, most importantly, I want to thank Angelique and Synced for having me on here today, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Damon. I really love that this was your idea to do this talk, and it's very much in line with what we're doing at Sync Live. We have a rainwater harvesting expert that's going to be at Sync Live, like you said, landscape architects, talking about stormwater management, but also there's a new hardscaping product from the UK that's being launched at our event that is permeable paving, and it's something that can be used instead of block paving for driveways, and it's 20 times more permeable than block paving and goes in as in a laid as a driveway 5 times quicker. So we're really excited to get some of these niches in the same room to talk about how we can do things better. Also, I think one thing you said earlier about the concrete and having water, how we've been managing water, is that it seems like there's a huge opportunity here to capture that water from our hardscaping to use in our softscaping to make a big impact. And we do have an expert on tree watering too, that's going to be there. So lots of niches that I'm really excited about getting everybody in the same room to collaborate. I know we'll come up with some very innovative solutions and maybe some forward plans to do more trials.
And that's what's really exciting is, these different areas, they're all discrete examples of green infrastructure. But what's great about Synced, especially Synced Live, is getting all these people from specializing in these different areas and seeing how it all integrates together. Just like your point, permeable paving directly to softscape irrigation, so many ways to really link it all together.
Yeah. No, I'm really excited. And thank you for this presentation. Like I said, very much in line with what we're building to up until February. So thank you so much for your time. Does anybody have any questions? Oh, sorry, there is a question. Yes, the recording will be available to you.